Let me start with a minute outside of the U.S.-China context for a moment, because sometimes you can get siloed into thinking in boxes that we shouldn't be in, and think a little bit about what a superpower is and how a superpower interacts with the rest of the world. And I think the United States, as we all know, is a superpower. I'd say as a superpower, we're in a little bit of a wobbly situation right now. But China is very much on its way. It's already, of course, a regional superpower, but it's becoming a global superpower. What does it mean? Superpowers deploy themselves in four ways: economically, militarily, morally, and through institutions and ideas. And if you compare the United States and China, they have very different profiles in those arenas. And lately, the United States has had some trouble, I would argue, in all four of these, and China is not fully mature in all of them. Economically, the United States has managed to, export toxic financial products to the rest of the world. Our global financial crisis had a very deleterious impact, very negative impact on the rest of the world. And while we may not think about that every day to day, lots of the world is still angry at us for what happened in that, including some of our friends in China. But the United States, for quite a long time, was the cutting edge, the essential turbocharged example of how an economy should work. But to some degree, the United States has fallen in the eyes of the little world about being the coach in that area. China, of course, has, if it had 8% growth in a year, that would be a miserable year. China has been growing at gangbusters for a very long period of time, but it continues to have a currency that is not globally tradable. It has enormous internal problems. With all of the folks that talk about how great Chinese economic growth is, it's still important to remember, as many of my Chinese government friends tell me, it's still 100th in per capita income in the world. And so China is an interesting combination. I wrote an article recently called Beijing's Fragile Swagger, that on one hand, China was increasingly important, increasingly had backbone on lots of issues, and wanted to say with its rising prominence. But at the same time, we don't have to look at what its fragilities are. China regularly points to its enormous challenges, both in terms of maintaining its internal chemistry and the dynamic of distribution of economic opportunity across the world, and that it has done a miraculous thing, and I think it is raised 300 million people out of poverty through its economic growth, and it's on plans now in the next 15 to 20 years to try and do the same thing again, to urbanize another 300 million people. You may not know what that means, because we're not talking about it putting in real human terms, which you don't have, but that will be the biggest economic event the world has ever seen in a very short period of time. In all of human history, we've not seen that many people driven out of poverty that fast. It will become the driving edge of economic activity globally, in all that it means, both negatively and positively. And I put that out there on the economic front because so much of the relationship is discussed in those terms. Because while the United States is a superpower, it also tells you that power is a function of future expectations. That what you do in the future, and I often tell people, this doesn't entirely work, but a metaphor for thinking about why China, still relatively small in many, many ways, is given such a premium on power, given forums like this today. China is the Google of countries today. China is a country, the CEO of Google is the chairman of my board. Google used to be tiny just a few years ago, and it has just grown enormously. And it's the expectation of growth that gives Google that stock price, that gives Google that market power. And China today is the country that people think 20, 30 years from now, the promise of what it will be matters. In contrast, the United States, which I love and would love to see doing better, is nonetheless kind of looks like the General Motors of nations. It's sort of a well-branded, sprawling, lots of capacity, but slightly underperforming country. And it needs to figure out how to rewire that capacity and reinvent itself, very much like a company does, to put itself back. I think the United States can eventually do that, but you can't do it by not facing the facts that there is a different premium in the way the world looks. When you get into the military side and moral and ideas and institutions, I'll be much more brief. Militarily, I think China, which has just put out a defense white paper, is trying very hard to be a very different kind of military entity, that they are proud of getting folks out of Libya. They are proud of having more UN peacekeepers than any other nation in the world today. They're proud of a new commitment to transparency. Their military budgets are still going through the roof. But they are relatively modest compared to the size of the U.S. military that the United States has. And I tend not to worry about that. The United States, in contrast, spends more money on its security and defense than all other nations in the world combined today, yet doesn't feel like a safe country. I mean, it is a remarkable thing. They often say the next 15 to 20 nations. The fact is, when you throw in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's more than every other nation in the world that we spend. And nonetheless, we still have this feeling in the United States of being militarily overextended. That's a problem. When you're militarily overextended, the consequences are your allies don't count on you as much as they otherwise would, and your enemies move their agendas. And in that environment, lots of other nations, including China, are good friends. Nonetheless, they're not going to necessarily help us make our decisions better, and it's important for them to try and take advantage from their own interest of the situation. I often ask, I was in China a few years ago, and we were not yet in Libya, not yet had not had the surge in Afghanistan, but I asked them, what is China's grand strategy in the world? And my interlocutor from the Chinese Foreign Ministry joked with me and said, our strategy is that life is pretty good when you Americans are distracted in small Middle Eastern countries. And so, not that they can really distract us, it was a joke, but it helped us raise the question that when the United States, which has global challenges all over the world, we have assets all over the world, we do have a tendency lately to pick a small piece of it and turn it into a Moby Dick, that we focus so much attention and resources that we undertend other things. And in that environment, China has been able to move in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in building its relations and assets and economic relations and opportunities without much challenge or attention from the United States. And I think that's a fundamental problem in the relationship long term. Not that China's doing anything wrong in that. They're doing everything that's right for their interests. It's that the United States needs to actually get better at balancing its own attention and interests and realize it's not just a function of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. We're both so big. We both have so many global assets and energy, and we're working through climate change and thinking about how the global economy should run, that we need to be globally attentive, just like China's being globally attentive. Morally, I think the United States has problems on this front. We often talk about and skip over human rights. I don't look at at relations with other countries generally through a primary portal of human rights, but I also believe that human rights should never be off the table, that it should be in the mix of things we discuss. And President Hu Jintao admitted and said as much in his own discussions. But the United States has its own problems with Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, or recently these awful situations of killings in Afghanistan of innocent civilians. China, I don't know if it's been mentioned in the Congress, is not fully comfortable with some of its own democracy activists. Had a gentleman receive the Nobel Peace Prize this year and is still detained. And in that arena, it's not that one country should be given the caveat to, and the wherewithal to meddle and to intervene in another country, but it should be able to raise these issues. We both do. China does. China is very proud that it has so many UN peacekeepers out there. So it is de facto engaged in same kind of decisions about how to keep people safe and what their role should be. And ideas and institutions, the fact is that we have institutions that the United States and its allies helped build after World War II that are anachronistic, out of date, that no longer work with the way power is distributed in the world. China is in some of these and not in some of the others. Brazil, South Africa, India are all, Turkey, incredibly important countries, and you can't really find them in the key leadership positions in these institutions. I think China, which along with India, Brazil, Russia, and Germany, voted to abstain in the recent Libya Libya resolution in the UN. One, it's interesting that they abstained, didn't veto the resolution. I might have vetoed the resolution because I'm not thrilled with what we're doing in Libya, which is another conference. But the fact that China chose to abstain showed that they understood that they were willing to basically work within the international system. But its partners in that abstention are not permanent members of the UN Security Council and ought to. So we're back at that, and one of the things I find really important with where China goes in the future, it may have more wherewithal and creativity to think about how international institutions should be changed to meet the next era. I meet a lot of people in China who are extraordinary on that front. Let me just quickly go through a couple of other things I'd like to put on the table. When Hillary Clinton was running against Barack Obama for president in the Democratic Party, she tried to get President Bush, then President Bush, to boycott the Olympic Games ceremonies that were opening in Beijing. And I wrote a piece challenging Hillary Clinton. I was neither for Hillary nor Obama at that time, was keeping my powder dry. But I said how unpresidential that could be. That was a very unpresidential comment. Why? And I'll tell you why. And it gives you an idea of how I look at China and the United States and their very interesting and complex relationship in which both of them need each other so much, but yet occasionally antagonize each other and will continue to. Hillary Clinton tried to get George Bush not to go because of blaming China for events in Darfur and Tibet and didn't want him to go to this. And I said, this is crazy. This is such an important, psychologically important moment for the Chinese people that to basically try to shame them at a moment where you would neither solve Darfur, you would not solve Tibet, and you would raise the cost of your relationship with China and everything you needed China for. What do we need China for? Well, remember, this is in September of the election year. The global financial crisis had not yet come down completely on our heads, but was about to. You had North Korea that continually misbehaves, in which it's vital to have a good working relationship with China. Iran and all of the activities in dealing with Iran and the spread of weapons of mass proliferation. Climate change was a huge issue in which there's no climate change strategy that can work in the world today without Chinese enthusiasm and deep involvement. So every other international issue one can think of, China's in the mix. And yet you were going to raise the price of dealing with them across the board. And what's interesting is when Hillary became a member of the administration, she changed track. I wrote the fact that she was going to have to give herself a makeover when she came in to the White House, that they would have to basically begin looking in a much more constructive way in the U.S.-China relationship. And what is interesting, and I'm getting close to finishing here, but when it was interesting in that, I was at the U.S.-China Strategic Dialogue Dinner in June 2009, where we had a vice premier of China, the deputy foreign minister of China, and they had an extraordinary time. It was such a lovey-dovey relationship. There was nothing raised that was an issue. Barack Obama and Hu Jintao had successfully kind of helped recreate confidence in the global economic system when the global financial house was on fire and there were such huge problems. But the problem with that is it was unrealistic. Not a single human rights issue was raised, not a single negative issue was raised. Battles over China's currency and where it should be were not raised. It was a very overwhelmingly positive experience. That's unhealthy. And what did we swing to from that? Then we went to the obverse. The president met the Dalai Lama. We sold a few $1 billion of military equipment to Taiwan, and things got messy. The Chinese said, "You're not the strategic partner we thought we were getting. You're meeting the Dalai Lama. You're selling weapon systems to a renegade province. This is not the strategic partnership we envisioned." We were upset because we thought the Chinese would be helping us more on Iran, that some of the actions they were taking in the South China Sea, in terms of defining their borders, etc., we saw as antithetical to our interests, and things got messy. And so we went to a very negative corner in just a year. I mean, it's a remarkable swing. And now, after Hu Jintao's visit and his meeting with President Obama, I would say we're back exactly where we should be, which is somewhere in the middle, that we both have a realistic understanding of each other, that we have 29 different arenas of constant, ongoing interests. And some of them are going to blow up every once in a while. But then you've got 28 or 27 others that are going to be very healthy. There is no more important relationship in the world today than the U.S.-China relationship at all compared to any other thing. And the notion that you can wall yourself off from each other or not, we're both going to matter to each other in huge ways for a very, very long period of time. And it is healthy to argue. It is healthy to have problems in the relationship. It is healthy to talk about different approaches to economic and security and human rights interests, and to do it in a civil and healthy way. We both got a little bit too comfortable with brinksmanship. China engaged in brinksmanship, testing our lines, and we did the same thing. And that is a highly unhealthy strategy for managing one of the most important relationships in the world. So let me conclude there, and hopefully you take that as an optimistic sign than rather having something that is overly and almost in a silly way too optimistic, that we need to basically get to know each other in a highly healthy way that begins to put all the interests on the table. Thank you very much.
The previous speaker has set the bar so high, so I'll do a little struggling. What I'm going to do, I'll lay out a few thoughts. And of course, after that, I'll welcome any comments and questions as usual. The first I will read about the question because for the time being, lots of questions asking about China's foreign policy. Is China become more assertive? Is China become more tough? Or where does China will go? And all these questions. Secondly, in order to answer all these questions, I think it's absolutely necessary to go back to see what are the building blocks for China from my observation. And the third part, I will narrow down my topic a little bit to focus on particularly how China and the United States live with each other in Asia. Because certainly I regard that as a test point in the future. And of course, I'll conclude by a few thoughts. Let me go to the first one. This is always the question. I have been encountering numerous questions since last year about China's foreign policy. The narrative here is China going to become a superpower? Or China is become tough? There is all these questions. They also cite some examples. For example, last year when China took a very harsh reaction to Americans' sales arms to Taiwan, just now the previous speaker also touched upon that. And also China opposed Americans' aircraft carrier to enter in the Yellow Sea to conduct a military exercise, which is pretty close to China. And third example, the people always took the case say, well, China is facing off with Japan over the Diaoyuidao territory disputes, all these sort of things. All this is just part of it. It demonstrates, it's a showcase how the perceptions have ever been generated. And, well, the fundamental question is China's rise or is China's growing will come at the expense of others' well-being or security? I think this is also the question for me to answer. And what I'm doing, I'm trying to figure out. In order to answer all these questions, it's quite necessary to look at what are the fundamental building blocks for China's foreign policy. Let me make a complicated issue simple. 4 building blocks, basically. The first one, China attached great importance to our relations with the major countries. America is the number one. And, well, the previous speaker mentioned about America is a superpower. That's absolutely true. And I don't think China has any intention or whatsoever the capability to be a superpower. We don't think that is a golden apple, right? But in order to address all those problems, we have to work out a very constructive, cooperative with other major powers. For example, with the United States, after the trajectory we've been through, and since the last summit in January, the 2 presidents, China and the United States, agree we will build a cooperative partnership based on mutual respect and mutual trust. I think this is a narrative we should really think about what it will mean. And of course, the U.S. is not only the only one big power. China also, we try to develop our good relations with Russia. This world is so big, right? China has established a strategic partnership with Russia, and so does the European Union as a whole. European Union is the number 1 trading partner of China. And so Europeans, we also have the strategic partnership. And with India, with Japan, we all have this strategic partnership. That is the narrative to define the nature of our relationship, because this is absolutely not a zero-sum game. The second building block is how about China's neighbor. In the previous section, I touched upon China borders with numerous neighboring countries. And we certainly regard this as a great asset and treasure for China. So China attaches great importance to develop various kind of relationship with them. For example, one of the very prominent is the institution building, particularly after the first financial crisis that is happening in the 90s last century. And since that, everybody recognized we got to work together to fight against any possible kind of the financial meltdown or economic downturn. So you have seen the booming of the institution building in Asia Pacific. China has been part of it. We're working very hard with the ASEAN, and you have the ASEAN Plus One. You have seen the ASEAN Plus China, Japan, South Korea. Of course, later on you have an EAS, East Asia Summit. Now, happily, we have to say America is also part of this EAS process. We welcome that. We will see America will play a constructive part in this. And of course, the third layer is about developing countries. How about developing countries? China has been noted that last year China's GDP passed Japan as the number 2, and we have heard in the mornings discussing. But if you measure by per capita, China only ranks 100. So what a difference. And it provides China powerful incentive to work together with other developing countries. China will remain to be a developing country in years, in decades to come. This is not the time for us to celebrate. We became the number 2. But on the other hand, we do see the tremendous challenge from the internal and from outside as well. The last but not least, China is also working vigorously to develop its relations with multilateral institutions. This has been also very important for us if you want to understand the foreign policy. Just now, Stephen mentioned about China's, for example, one of the policy of non-interference, others internal matters. This is also the question raised earlier in the morning. I probably disagree with Stephen's conclusion that China is moving to somewhat to practice the interference. You cite the case of a peacekeeper. As I understand, the peacekeeper is absolutely a different case because it's a mandate by UN security. So it's giving the kind of mandatory regulatory. China is just under the knife for that. So it's very different. Of course, since the financial crisis, China has been working very hard to play its part, actively participate in the Group of 20, for example. This has become a primary instrument in addressing the global economic issues and financial issues. And all these transnational issues we mentioned earlier today, they need very kind of multilateral instrument to do that. So, having said all this, I don't mean China will just shoulder off its responsibility. As a matter of fact, China recognizes as China grows, we should bear more responsibility and institution. But certainly, as I said, we will try to make the balance. That is to say, we will do our best, but we will not go into, it's inconceivable for China to shoulder more responsibility than it should. The third part, how about the question? People are talking about China-U.S. relations will define the 21st century. I think it's true to some extent. But the overall China-U.S. relations will actually depend upon how China and the U.S. interact in Asia. That's very important. At the very beginning, I lay out some of the arguments, observations, narratives, just raised because China and the U.S. had some tough time in accommodating with each other in Asia Pacific. I think two things are critically important in looking at this issue. The first of all, respect to each other's core interest is so important. Secondly, again, I'm a fan of a win-win scenario. I'm not a fan of zero-sum game. So we should perceive with each other with a new mindset. This mindset actually reflects the 21st century rather than the last century. In conclusion, China's rise is not and should not be a concern for other countries, but a new opportunity. If you look at China's performance in the past 2 years during the financial crisis, China has become an engine to drive the world economy from the recession. Of course, I don't mean to exaggerate China's role, but this is for the first time we have seen China play such a critical role in doing that. And the stakes are so high, and we both sides have a powerful incentive to work together. The bottom line is the world is not or big enough for China and the United States. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
What can China do to solve the psychological insecurity of the American people in terms of their own national security?
Nothing. No, I mean, honestly, our psychological insecurities as a nation are tied to a lot of confusion about what America's place in the world is today, how we're achieving that, and what it will become. The responsibility for getting that house in order relies entirely with us. The notion that China should be responsible for us to become in tune with that doesn't make much sense. You know, China, if I may put some words in the Chinese leader's mouth, want to see an America that knows what it wants to do, that lays out a framework that it is committed to, that doesn't swing from one extreme to another. China sees a very inconsistent behavior from the United States today, and it throws off many other nations in the world. So the other answer is, what can the United States do to help the Chinese be less insecure about their own national security priorities? One thing we need to do is have a broad national discussion about what our strategy in the world should look like and how we're going to drill down to re-achieve that, how we're going to change the institutions in the terms of our engagement. Doing what we used to do, both by inertia and because of the strong forces of continuity, in my view, is highly dangerous. This is a time of great discontinuity in the world where lots of things need to be rethought, including how do you reinvent American leverage and power in a world that's in tremendous flux and where the global equilibrium that I think used to exist is now gone. We need to get that right. And then around that, other nations will find their space. So that would be my response.
Well, just very briefly, I absolutely agree with Stephen's observation and his answer. China really can do nothing, be very honest, for America to address its own problem. And I just want to add one note. This is a superpower problem. Once you become a superpower, it automatically bothers you all the time. So on one hand, you have the privilege, right, to be the shining on the hill. But on the other, you got to carry a lot of baggage. You got to sort it out by yourself.
Even though we seek interdependent relationships with China, oil these days, or any other form of energy, is a mainstay for two modern industrialized nations. My question is, since America is not a country that can provide said oil, will it urge China to seek stronger relationships with other oil-producing nations and outweigh the consequences of creating a better relationship with the U.S.?
I'm not sure I follow. Well, some of you apparently followed it better than I. Are you asking, just so that I know, is there a trade-off in China developing a closer relationship over its energy needs with oil-producing nations than the United States? Okay, great. Well, let me come back to what Dr. Zhongjie said. This is an area in which the zero-sum relationship is not between China and the United States, but between China and the United States on one side and the resource realities of the world. That China is now the largest energy consumer in the world. It's going to set the cutting edge of what happens in energy globally. It has done a smart job, I think, of not trusting the market entirely and going out and buying long-term futures contracts at very high prices for oil and energy. Doesn't mean the United States will be left out of that, but it does mean that there's a fundamental reality that both nations need to deal with. It's not just, I wouldn't just put fossil fuels in there and natural gas, but I would put the broader, coal in the United States case is going to be as problematic for our oil and energy, or our energy realities, as it is in China. That the real pressure is if you want to do anything on climate change. I'm one of those people who does not believe in that we're at a peak oil issue now, that there is technology that will come online and there's diversification. But you can get to that reality either through shocks or you can get through it through smart planning. The United States and China do have a bit of a strategic competition going on, but Japan is involved in this, the EU is involved in this. There are lots of other players. But it's not as zero-sum, I think, as you would think. And it's not just that oil-producing nations would be there. But let me tell you about something that does bother me a little bit about American, I don't know whether to call it arrogance or being asleep at the switch. America right now is in a position where it thinks that it is useful to strike out militarily, to either to defend people or to take on dictators, etc., on an ad hoc basis. Fundamentally, when you look at oil and energy dependence around the world, it's not necessarily what the United States is dependent. The United States sees itself as a guarantor of security for a largely fungible energy system. And that Japan today, for instance, is highly dependent physically on Iranian oil. The Europeans are physically dependent, their whole refining process, on Iranian oil. And Iran and Russia today collectively would dwarf the undeveloped oil and natural gas reserves, say, of Saudi Arabia. And if you get into a military conflict, which we may be on the road to with Iran, I ask myself, I step back as a geostrategist and say, how much would it take Russia and Iran, who have been strategic adversaries at various points, to say, let's get over that. Let's have a much closer relationship. We've got the oil and energy reserves in the world of the future. And guess what? We have this great strategic relationship with China evolving. And if you have a condominium of interests of China, Russia, and Iran, it fundamentally breaks the back of what has largely been the U.S. hegemonic domination of the oil and energy realities in the world. It puts enormous pressures on Europe and Japan to stay with us. You change the entire geostrategic picture. That's why when we discuss conflict with Iran, it's not a casual issue. It's not a binary issue of yes or no. There are enormous deep consequences of the nature that you raised in your question. But I would say that the conflict is not between U.S. and China. It's over other big issues and who's controlling the game. Right now, the United States is. And I don't think we're going to continue if we continue in the track we are. Eventually, what you want to see is a mutual coordination with China and other great strategic players. But if you break down into conflict, then you will be in a horrible mess.
Well, very briefly, and I really have nothing to add at this point, but one thing I must say that one of the way out is that we will coordinate with other countries, the rest of the world, to ensure the stability in the region, particularly in the oil-producing region. That's fundamentally important because today it seems China and other consumers are more and more dependent on the Gulf, for example, Middle East and somewhere else. So it is also our interest to work with other countries to make sure that there will be a peace and a stability there, and so we can access or ensure the reliable energy supplies. And related to this, actually, is that one of the issues very often raised about how this energy issue relates to China-U.S. relations. Sometimes people maybe in their mind to think China just to forge a close relationship with some countries whom the United States happen not to like them. But the fundamental reason is that because China's energy or energy cooperation with them is mutually beneficial, and China provide to be a very reliable and a consumer and a market for them. And in the same time, the energy export for those countries, they provide very good public goods for themselves. And the relationship between between American and those countries, I think it is not China's problem. The U.S. and other countries should sort out their problem by themselves. So I think at this point, China has not just, some people may be perceived as to reign with some state to against the U.S. or whatsoever. There's no such kind of conspiracy over there.
What is the role of China in Africa? And in other words, what is the bottom line relations in Africa? And what is China's agenda in Africa?
Generally speaking, as I mentioned in my presentation, China certainly remains to be a developing country. So if you look at China's relationship with Africa in general, this is also one of the perceptions. You should remember that we share, as a developing countries, we share enormous common interests with each other. For example, China, we are trying to create more jobs for our students, graduates, and we are trying to develop our economy. We try to feed our people and shelter more people. I think very often we find this as a shared interest with our Africa friends. And, well, having said all this, I mean, China is not a newcomer, actually, with Africa. Our friendship relationship can trace back years ago. And the point is that some people question about China's, for example, the intention for forging this relationship with Africa just to, for example, to access the energy, just to earmark the oil or whatsoever. This is inaccurate, untrue. As a matter of fact, China, for example, even in Sudan, it is an example. It has to be a hot issue for the time being, but not currently. China spent lots of money in developing the infrastructure in Africa countries, and also China built up hospitals, built up the highway, built up schools, and lots of basic infrastructures for our Africa friends. Of course, this is mutual beneficial. We benefit from our cooperation from Africa friends, and the Africa people that welcome China's investment, that welcome China to train more expertise. As far as I understand, China also brings some students to China to train them, so they can have the know-how to start their own business and to have a good career. So I do see this as a mutual beneficial, and also it's based on the mutual trust, and it has a very strong foundation for our future.
If I may, just very quickly, one of China's former foreign ministers, Li Zhaozhang, during the Cultural Revolution, was assigned to Swaziland and learned Swahili. I can't think of the last time I could imagine a senior U.S. foreign policy Secretary of State or Deputy Secretary of State that had that kind of experience who went to the top. For us, Africa is more of a hobby, or we approach it as a philanthropic cause. The Chinese focus on it as an avocation and as something they can make money on in a mutually beneficial way. And there's a fundamental difference in the way America and China are approaching some of these developmental problems around the world. We may have the Gates Foundation, we may be worried about disease and bad stuff and trying to do some good things. China is doing what we did in the 1950s around the world, building infrastructure, telecommunications, dams, roads. They may be engaged, and you don't have to comment on this, in bribing certain people here and there in places where markets don't work, because it's a good way to move people where markets aren't working. But in that, they are building tomorrow's middle classes in these economies. And the United States is somewhat approaching this from a big brother, little brother point of view, which I know in much of Africa is not appreciated. So it just gives you a little slightly different frame in the way these two big countries are approaching a continent. And I tend to think that the way China's doing it was something the United States could learn a lot from in terms of both our own interests and actually generating more achievable results in the long run.
Yes, not too long ago we had East and West Germany and North and South Vietnam, and one of your neighbors is North Korea. So what can China do to better influence that country, which seems to be a tough thing for the group of six? And do you see in our lifetime the ability to merge those two countries in a peaceful manner?
Good luck.
Appreciate your question. It's very critical for all of us. And I think the answer is pretty straightforward. And China, I think, I'm not the person who think China can do a lot. Actually, I tend to look at the limit, the boundary, the boundary. What we can do is pretty limited. But having said all this, because you rightly mentioned that China and DPRK is a neighbor. We are pretty close neighbors for 1,000 years. So we care a great deal what is happening on the Korean Peninsula. The foremost for us is the stability, peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. We cannot just think it's the alternative, because nobody can really has the capability whatsoever to cope the unforeseen scenario for that. And having said all this, I think China, we do have regular contacts with our counterparts on the DPRK. I think one of the things I have to say is, if you look at China's performance in the last 30 plus years since opening up, it's really changed a great deal. It's a game changer. And this is actually demonstrate probably people may take different message from here. And I think this is the right way to integrate ourselves to the world. And because, as we have said, no man is an island anymore. It is even more relevant today. So my best wish to our friends on the Korean Peninsula. And stability is so precious. And I hope we can peacefully resolve the nuclear issues and the people have a better future there. Thank you.
North Korea is one of these interesting countries that survives essentially by extortion, survives by threatening with all of the bad things it can possibly do. And this analogy will get me in a lot of trouble, I'm sure, and I don't mean it in any moral way. But oftentimes people say, why can't China pressure North Korea? And while another country I'm about to mention is fully a democracy, I get it, but it's interesting because there's an interesting parallel where a state so dependent on the United States, Israel in the Middle East, they say, why can't you pressure Israel? Why can't you get Israel to do what you want to do? And essentially there are relationships sometimes where, in the case of Asia, North Korea and the instability it could create can create enormous hemorrhage and problems for China. So its goal in there is to preserve stability at almost any cost. That's its strategic goal. Our strategic goal is to get North Korea without nuclear weapons, and hopefully in subtle ways to get regime change. But our vectors are different. And what we want and what the Chinese want are very different. And North Korea knows this, and they exploit it. And my biggest worry right now is this last week there were a group of U.S. foreign policy, former government officials, they call it, without any involvement from the State Department, but that's entirely not true, had a meeting with North Korean officials. And what is North Korea threatening? North Korea is threatening, if we don't get fuel, food, and energy, that we're going to create trouble at the point when you've got now Libya, you've got Afghanistan, and they're threatening to ratchet up the problems again. I'm sure they're going through the same kind of exercise with China right now. So they extort from all of us, and the fundamental issue is we don't have much of a choice but to occasionally pay off and kind of be upset about it on the sidelines. And we now have a problem that we haven't discussed in the U.S. press much. We've just, no matter where people are, one way or the other, on the humanitarian action in Libya, we convinced Muammar Gaddafi a while ago to give up his nuclear weapons program. That country is now being invaded and intervened. What country out there do you think that either is on its way to nukes or has nukes is going to give up those weapons now? I can guarantee you there's no strategy at all ever to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons because of the Libya intervention, if it wasn't already pre-cooked with what happened. So we need to realize, and it's one of the most important thing I would tell people interested in foreign policy or larger strategic studies, these aren't simple siloed problems. That if a country or a group of countries takes action in one, you immediately create an appetite by other groups that want it, or you begin sending signals to the many thugs in the rest of the world about how they should behave or not behave. And we need to look at the echo effects strategically of all of these issues. And that's what we haven't been doing enough of.
Just a quick comment before I wrap up this panel. I think the fundamental issues discussed by the two speakers, I hope that they would motivate people to think more about this bilateral relationship between the two countries. Obviously, regardless how we look at each other, there is only one world, and we have to live with each other. So with that note, please join me in thanking our two speakers. Thank you very much.